Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. The Crops Forum was held recently with an excellent line of experts who had a very interesting discussion. It's worth listening back to some of this discussion as the panel talked about the financial risks of the year ahead and the potential supply of fertilisers in the short and medium term. In this episode, the discussion centres around the production risks for this year. Andy Doyle moderates this session with panel members from across the industry, including Kieran McEvoy from the IFA, Clive Carter from Irish Grain Growers, Donal Maloney from Tirlán, Enda McDonald from Grassland Agro, Bill Callanan from the Department of Agriculture, and Ciarán Collins, a tillage specialist in Teagasc.
I first of all want to call on Ciarán Collins to give us a quick overview of what he perceives as the basic cost structure that will exist for tillage farming in the year ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to try and just, I suppose, set the scene really, as Andy said, for the discussion that's going to follow. So, you know, I suppose we're all aware of the increase in costs going forward. And I suppose what I'm going to do over hopefully the next 10 minutes is maybe just have a snapshot view of what costs are looking like and what it will mean for returns for 23 harvest. So I suppose, you know, before we go forward, maybe a glance back in the rear view mirror is no harm. You know, 2021 harvest, you know, average yields were well above average. You can see there winter wheat 10.8 from the CSO, spring barley 7.9. We had a big increase in grain price at 210 euros a tonne. You know, we thought it couldn't get any better. This was our 1984. Well, we had it again this year. You know, we possibly slightly higher yields, that remains to be confirmed. You know, harvest weather was the best. I suppose most people can certainly remember, you know, very low moistures there. That was 11.2, a load of wheat that came in there during the harvest. And obviously we've had this increase in price, you know. And I suppose the other thing about 22, while we did have a cost increase, particularly fertilizer, you know, a lot of tillage farmers had their business done early in the season, so maybe just didn't hit that real peak of it. So, you know, so 22 and 21 were certainly two good years. However, we have to look forward. You know, I suppose everybody is really starting on a level playing field with regards fertilizer. It's the big one, but there are also challenges with other costs out there as well, and I'll go through that as well. So what I've done for the remainder of the presentation, I've taken the Teagasc Costs and Returns booklet. If my calculations are right, if Jim O'Mahony, I don't think he's in the room, but I think this would be, this year in January will be the 45th version of it, started by Jim, I think it was 1978. So again, we use the costs and returns to, I suppose, examine the costs and try and predict margins for the season ahead. So the figures I'm going to present today, I did them last week. They're out of date already. But again, the January version that will be published will possibly have different figures again. But I suppose it's our best estimate as we stand here today. So in terms of the costs, we've been very crude. We've taken a plus 10% on chemicals across the board. Now that wouldn't necessarily be true. You know, often you'll find variations between herbicides, insecticides, fungicides and that. So just for the purpose of the calculations today, we've taken 22 plus 10%. Seed plus 130 euros. That's the feedback we're getting there from the grain houses, or the seed houses, sorry. And we've added 5% to machinery. Now, just also it's worth saying the machinery that are used in the calculations are contractor charges, and we do an extensive review every spring of contractor charges. So again, that may change. We've just taken 5% at the minute based on 22. Fertilizer, I won't go through them all. Look, 10, 10, 20, 975, Canada 860. They're going to be the two standout ones. I was told yesterday that Canada's reached €1,000. I'm not sure, but look, that's what we've used in the calculations. And again, I suppose, you know, grain prices will be out of date an hour after you kind of look at them, but we've taken, I suppose, the most recent forward price that was available. So we've taken barley at 240 euros a tonne. We've added 50 for malt. We've added a tenner for wheat at 250. We've minus a tenner for oats at 230. We've taken the forward price of rape green at 570. and we have beans in there at 300. And just one last one on the calculations, we've taken straw, and SIM has been a hugely successful scheme, huge benefits to the tillage industry. So I suppose it makes our job easier in terms of the value of straw, in that it's put a minimum value of €250 a hectare. The one exception to that is winter barley tends to command a little bit more of a premium. We obviously have more of it. So that's in at €300 net. And then you've got winter oilseed rape, the SIM rate there at 150. So yeah, the booklet it's on a single page. If you haven't got it in your lap there, you'll catch them on the way out. They're just inside the door. But based on I suppose the input and output cost that we're talking about there, we've taken the 5-year CSO yield average. Okay, so that's 18, 19, 20, 21. We've done our own estimate for 22, because taking obviously 1 year in on its own doesn't make a lot of sense. Beans is the only exception. We've taken a 10-year average there because 2018 completely disproportionately affected the beans figure there. So the beans is a 10-year CSO average there, or Teagasc harvest report average. So again, I suppose the margins, taking all of that into account on your 5-year average yield, they do follow a similar trend to previous years, in that spring feed barley tends to be the lowest margin there, €422. Winter wheat and the high value crops like malting barley tend to be at the higher end. I suppose probably the big difference from maybe previous years, and I suppose it was there last year's winter oilseed rape, now is a very high margin crop, and I suppose obviously that's to do with the high output price there. And I suppose the one that kind of jumps off the page, and I won't go into all the details about the protein payment, we might get a chance in the discussion later on, but beans obviously are coming out there very high at 1006 based on a 5.4 ton average. And again, that's to do with an increase in protein payment, which we can talk about in a minute. I suppose crucially then is, you know, I have my costs. I don't know what the price of grain is going to be. So what we need to look at then is what's the cost of producing that ton of grain with those costs that we have used. So again, without going through them all, I take the big one, spring feed barley. €216 is costing to produce a ton. That excludes straw, which will add another €250 a hectare. Or winter wheat, €222 there, the cost of producing that ton based on a 5-year average. Okay, so I did a very crude sum there. I just took wheat, barley, oats, and I said, what's the general green, you know, cereal price that we need to break even based on those costs? And that's €215 a ton. So oats the low end and wheat the high end there. So then I suppose there's big implications then in the amount of money that we invest in our business and what we're going to need to grow our crops. So what I've done here is I've compared the variable costs for each crop. And I've compared that from the 21, because I suppose 21 was the last time that we kind of had, I suppose we'll call it normal, inverted commas, fertilizer prices, and then based on the 23 projections at the moment. So again, just to take the headline crops there again, winter wheat, you're looking at a 65% increase in costs from that 1330 in 21. Total variable cost to 2,200 is our estimate today. And again, I suppose if you take the spring crops then tend to have a lower percentage increase. So spring barley, 1,014 in 21, and that figure jumps up to nearly 1,600 there in 23. That's a 56% increase. Obviously not as big. Fertilizer having a big input there. And if we go to the bottom of the page there, beans obviously having the lowest percentage increase because of its relatively low input costs in general, but obviously nitrogen and fertilizer in general being the big difference there. So just I suppose, what does it look like in a farmer scenario? So I've looked at two scenarios. Looked at a winter cereal or winter cropping farmer and a spring cropping farmer. I've taken a 150 hectare farmer and I've just put in a fairly sort of standard rotation there with winter wheat and barley, you know, with winter oilseed rape and winter oats there as break crops. And again, I won't go through all the individual figures, just 30 hectares of crops, as you can see there on the screen. So your costs from 21 again, which we're using as the base year, of 183,000, and that's a 62% increase up to 300,000 today. So 62% there is the change. And again, I suppose reflecting what we saw in the previous slide in terms of our variable costs, lower increases overall for spring crops. So again, I've taken 150 hectares there again, use spring beans and spring oats as two break crops mixed amongst 3 crops of spring barley, a 48% increase for that 150 hectare farmer. So again, you know, I suppose that sort of puts in real money, you know, what's required to grow those crops in 23. So, and just as a kind of a summary there, you know, the cereals break even figure, I've used a crude figure there across wheat, barley and oats of 215. There's a range there of 180 to 227. The highest margin crops are still malting barley and winter oilseed rape. Winter wheat could fit in there as well. Beans because of their protein payment. And then our 150 hectare farmer, you know, the winter grower, we're talking about a 62% increase in costs, and our spring grower there at 48. So that's just to maybe set the scene.
Thank you very much, Kieran. If you can get yourself a mic up there, but coming with a head mic, I think. We might just get a head mic for Kieran. He's the extra one this after joining. So we're going to progress. I'm going to first of all introduce the panel that's with me, because that's important. We have a representation from the industry. Beside me here is Enda McDonald representing the fertilizer industry. Maybe you don't quite feel like that or want to do that, but that's you're here on behalf of. With Kieran, you've met. Clive Carter is a farmer and also secretary of the grain growers. Kieran McEvoy, farmer in Laois again, chairman of IFA. Then we have Bill Callanan from the department, and forgive me for ignoring anybody's titles. And then Donal Maloney. Donal, if it was last week or the week before, I would have said you were Lambia. Now you're either Tirlán or Tirlán, one or the other. But we know what you're representing, in a sense, the grain industry and the challenges that are there for the year ahead. Year in years, probably, you know, this time, well, no, maybe 9 months ago, we were talking about something that was in a sense about 2022. But for those of us kind of with any level of vision, it was very obvious that 2022 was going to spill far beyond 22 and may not at all stabilize by 2023. But, you know, given the numbers that Kieran has outlined, and I think, Kieran, if I'm getting it right, for the spring grower there, I think you added on his cost of about 125,000. Yeah, onto it. Like, that's a phenomenal cost to be bringing into the equation. I also note that you picked a price number which is lower as a baseline than this year, because you realistically can't expect those prices to increase. The market may very well drive them, but in terms of doing budgeting, it's always a precarious place to be. And if I might start there, Donal at the other end. Donal, you know, as you see the market going forward, you know, is there anything in the market that will give farmers the confidence of thinking that feed barley will be thereabouts 300 plus for the year ahead, which would be absolutely needed to carry those costs? I'm not asking you to commit a price, Donal, don't get me wrong on that. It's just what is your view as a person that's directly buying a lot of grain in Ireland?
Yeah, you're talking about for 2023, Andy.
2023, Donal, yeah.
I suppose, look, we're a good bit off it at the moment. Ciarán's prices are not unrealistic. Talking about a forward price for next year at 240, maybe 250 today. The general thing, I suppose, a lot of what you read suggests that, you know, grain prices have to go up. That's not a given by any means. You know, if you look historically, you know, people think grain prices should go up because fertilizer price is so high at the moment. But if you look historically, fertilizer tracks grain rather than the other way around. And but at the same time, I suppose there is a scenario that if fertilizer prices are so high at the moment, and possibly an availability issue as well, you know, there's a sense that people won't grow grain, and that's not just in Europe, that could be worldwide, and that could drive prices up. But I think it's sensible to budget on what's there at the moment. I think because of such volatility in the market, and there has been such volatility in the market, it's reasonable to expect that prices are going to go up and down possibly over the next number of months. And I would suggest like that, you know, even if you've never looked at it before, forward selling is a great tool in terms of closing out risk. And that's the theme of the conference, I suppose, is how do you manage the risk? So if you look back at the previous 5 or 6 months, you know, we're looking at harvest prices probably somewhere in around 300 euros a tonne, but prices have been as high as 350 or 360 euros a tonne only a few months back. So opportunities will present themselves, I think, to take higher prices than we see today. And I think just people have to be prepared. And the best way of preparing, and the first step in preparation, I suppose, is know your costs and what it's going to cost you to grow the crop. And then you're in a better position to see where you're making money at some stage down the line.
Thanks, Donal. Kieran, as a grower, yourself and Clive, in a sense, the same question, you know, how are you going to behave, change, alter the farming system based on the numbers that you see there presented?
I suppose, thanks, Andy, for the opportunity to be here first anyway. But look, I suppose I don't have any magic answer to people have to make their own decisions ultimately. But I suppose regarding, you know, as Donal has alluded to, forward selling, and it's something I'm doing, and I know a lot of people here will be doing forward selling. You get it wrong, you get it right, but you're spreading your risk. And if you can take a position with forward selling that you're making a profit on reasonable sums and proper, you know, calculations, you know, that's probably something, you know, it's probably not, I would have said, Andy, since, you know, February, March, that crop 23 is the bogey crop here. You know, we could, you know, some of us had some cheaper inputs. We knew where we were going, markets were good, but I think crop 23 is the bogey crop. You know, we just don't know what's going to happen, whether fertilizer is going to be available, whether it's going to be €1,000 a tonne, whether the war's over at Christmas and fertilizer collapses. I know Enda will have thoughts on that, but, you know, we just don't know. There's too many unknowns. So I suppose at some stage you have to question what crops you're going to sow. And both myself and Max were out in Europe as late as yesterday, and a lot of farmers making harsh decisions there on crops, both on some of it is down to weather phenomena as well. So I suppose the question is, there's huge risk there in the position that we're in with input costs. And, you know, we had a good year this year, but we're not always guaranteed high yields or great yields or anything like that. We have to be optimistic, and sure we all are as tillage farmers, in fairness. But, you know, maybe some of these crops that are taking less inputs to grow might be an option, you know. And I suppose the real question I'm going to ask on my farm anyway is, where crops didn't perform, you know, what's going into those fields next year? Well, you know, winter barleys and winter wheat won't be going into them. And I think, you know, that's something, you know, that you have to really question. And again, I think it comes back to forward selling and forward buying, whether it's the right price or the wrong price. If you can kind of manage the two together and have a margin in between, I think, you know, some of the risk will have to be taken earlier rather than later, because we just don't know.
Kieran, thanks for that. And if I could just make a comment in passing, that we're all very much aware, and you are the same as me, that all the indicators are at this point for a lower global production of grains for the 2022-23 harvest. But parallel to that is the other variable, which is the impact of a recession that's now regarded as being real, and what that's going to do for demand. And while demand for grains is generally more durable than the demand, say, for some animal proteins and the likes, if there's a reduced demand for them, there will in turn be a reduced demand for grains. And that's how things work through the system. And that's one of the big uncertainties that many of the big players in the market have today. Clive?
Yeah, Andy, thanks. And thanks for the opportunity to talk. We can look at the analysis and projections for months to come, and we probably will. But if you don't have a crop grow or to sell, you won't have any margin. And I probably got burned a little bit. And this year for a client, you know, looking in the spring about coming back a little bit of nitrogen, and we did. And we suffered in the spring barley on proteins. We were way too low. And just looking at my own little projections, that I'd probably push ahead or try as best as I can to locate fertilizer and push ahead with the crops, because look at, as you say, all indications are that prices could go way up. You know, it is an elephant in the room that, as I've told you before, Andy, like there's only a handful of places that are producing more arable land. We're losing arable land year on year. We are seeing reduced harvests, more demand, more people, and something has to give. And I think there might be a bit of a lull at the minute. There usually is after harvest sometimes, but over the winter and potentially spring. And I'm not a trader or anything, or a market analyst. I just feel that there's potential there, looking at the fundamentals, that prices could rise. So we have to take that into account before everything too. If we can get the fertilizer and get the ingredients to get the crops first and foremost. And look at, you can see, and Bill will probably allude, look at the department and the government to a bigger extent want more grain in this country. So are we contradicting ourselves by cutting down our own production and then moving it into other areas? So maybe that's something Bill might be able to answer. That are we going to look after the tillage farmers in the next tillage incentive scheme?
That's a job for a different day.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Andy and all the panel members for joining me on the podcast. In order to understand the aspects of the podcast which are most appealing and beneficial to you, I would greatly appreciate if you could take 3 to 4 minutes to complete the survey. The details of this are in the podcast notes. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.